As we get into it this morning, I'm reminded of a quote from Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa said this. She said, "I know God won't give me more than I can handle. I just wish he didn't trust me so much." And how many of you have ever felt like that? You feel like, man, God, I trust you, but wow, this is really a lot. You're going through a trial, you're going through a burden. Maybe that's you today. I bring this up because today in our text, literally and figuratively, we're looking at the trials of Paul in Jerusalem. And like all trials, there's both a demonic side to them and there's a divine aspect to them. And we're going to see that here in Paul's circumstance. He's doing a work for the Lord. The enemy hates it. He's going to attack it. And yet God promises that he's going to be working in the midst of it. And so we left off last week with Paul being held in custody by Felix, who's the governor of Jerusalem. And Felix had succeeded Pontius Pilate in that role. And he was wicked and he was corrupt. And the last verse of chapter 24 that Pastor Darius did a great job of covering last week, it concludes informing us that not only did Felix unjustly hold Paul in custody for 2 years, but then when he left office and was succeeded by Festus, who's the dude that's in charge now, we'll read about him today, he left Paul still in prison. He could have released him. I mean, our presidents do that when they're ending their term. They pardon people. He knew that he was innocent, and yet he wanted to do the Jews a favor, and so he left Paul in prison for Festus to deal with. And of course, what we're going to see is that all of this is actually according to God's design. In fact, it's fulfilling prophecy that the Holy Spirit gave in Acts 20, verse 33, prophecy that Jesus gave in Acts 23, verse 11. And that prophecy was this, that ultimately Paul is going to bring the gospel to Rome through all of this. And so that's God's work, but his testimony is not without trial. It's been said to have a testimony, you actually have to have a moni, and Paul is going through his moni here, the moans of trial. So Acts chapter 25, we pick it up, verse 1. It says, "Now when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. And then the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favor against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem," him being the Apostle Paul, "while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him," right? You remember the reverse of this a couple of years ago? They were going to lay in ambush while they brought Paul to Caesarea. Well, this time they're saying, let's just reverse it, bring him back, and we'll kill him again. This is their plot. But, verse 4, Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore, he said, "Let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there's any fault in him." So in contrast to Felix, who took over for Pontius Pilate and who was wicked, Festus looks like a guy who rules justly, right? We see his character, if you will, reflected in a couple of things here in our text. Number one, rather than lounging in Caesarea, he gets right to work. And you got to understand, like if you've ever been to Israel on one of our trips, we go to Caesarea. And Caesarea is on the Mediterranean coast. It's a nice place. And the governor's palace was there on the beach overlooking, some prime Mediterranean coastline property. It was a lush place. And it could have been, now, for Festus, he's a Roman. So Jerusalem, in contrast to a beach villa, doesn't have a lot of appeal, for him. Like for us as Christians, Jerusalem's got a lot of appeal because of all that it represents and all the significant biblical events that have happened there and so on, and all that. But for him, new Roman governor, I'll take the beach villa, thank you very much, right? And he could have just coasted, could have pulled into Caesarea and parked himself and said, bring me another, drink, and I'm going to kick back and enjoy the sun. He doesn't do that. Immediately, he gets to work. He goes to Jerusalem. And, this is what we call in the business world management by walking around, MBWA. He's actually going to go. I'm in charge of this area. I want to eyeball the operation. And this is like a 4-day journey, like 75 miles. It's not like you hopping on a plane or whatever. So that's good character. He's showing good leadership. Second thing he does that reveals his good character is he rejects these Jews' unlawful scheme to kill Paul. Right? No, I'm not going to bring Paul up here. Right? And the third thing that Festus does is he offers a lawful path to the Jews to press their complaint legally. He says, hey, you got a complaint about this guy. Come with me back to Caesarea. I'll bring Paul into trial, and we can do this the legal way, and you're welcome to do that. But now, in stark contrast to Festus's reasoned and rational behavior, I want you to notice the completely irrational and unhinged behavior of these Jews. What do? No sooner does he get there, Festus, than they immediately, hey, we got to kill this guy. They hatch this scheme that they're going to kill Paul. And I want you to think about it. It has been fully 2 years since they lost their lid about Paul when he went into the temple area and they thought that he had brought Gentiles with him and defied the temple. Like, this was 2 years ago. 2 years they have been stewing and brewing and just fanning the flames of their anger, right? And that's a lot of hate. This dude, Paul, he's been gone for 2 years. He hasn't said nothing to them, right? Nothing to further perpetuate it. And yet, the very first thing the governor does, they do when we got a new shot at Paul, let's kill him. Let's kill this guy. These so-called religious leaders, right? These men of God. We're going to hatch this wicked plan. We're going to scheme to kill an innocent man. And man, I gotta hit the pause button right here because we need to reflect on this issue, what it's like to stew and to brew and to hate so much. The Apostle Peter said this: you are a slave to whatever controls you. That word slave, it's doulao in the Greek, and the idea is literally to enslave or to reduce to bondage. So you're chained to whatever controls you. And let me ask you a question. Are you chained to your anger today for someone? You're like, oh, that pisses me off, right? That makes me mad. Listen, some of you are chained to your anger. We can be enslaved and in bondage to a lot of things, right? We can be enslaved to drugs. We can be enslaved to alcohol. We can be enslaved to pornography. We can be enslaved to lust, to gluttony, to greed, to worry, to doubt, to fear. But there's a lot of people who don't realize that they can be enslaved to anger, and maybe in fact are. Maybe you're enslaved to anger today. See, just like these Jews, you can be completely oblivious to how much anger is actually controlling you. See, Paul's the guy who's bound in house arrest, but in truth, it's the Jews who are bound and enslaved to their hatred. In his book, Wishful Thinking, Transformed by Thorns, Frederick Buechner says this. He says, of all the sins, anger is possibly the most fun. To lick your wounds, to smack your lips over grievances long past, to roll over your tongue the prospect of bitter confrontations still to come, to savor to the last toothsome morsel both the pain you are given and the pain you are giving back. In many ways, it's a feast fit for a king. The chief drawback is that what you are wolfing down is yourself. The skeleton at the feast is you. You know, it reminds me of this story, and I double-checked it on the internet, so it's got to be true. But the Inuit Eskimos will hunt Arctic wolves. And when they do it, they have a certain mechanism that they've been using for hundreds of years. They take a very sharp knife and they dip it in blood, and then they allow the blood to freeze. And then they repeat the process. They dip it in blood, they allow it to freeze, and they do this over and over again. And when they finish up, they've got a blood popsicle, right? And they will bury the handle of the knife in the snow, and they just leave the blade exposed. And then what happens is this Arctic wolf will come along, and he's like, oh, a popsicle, and he starts, licking the blood. Well, because it's frozen and because multiple licks to get to the center of the Tootsie Roll pop, right? The old ones of you will remember and laugh about that commercial. Anyway, as the wolf licks the blood, his tongue goes numb, and pretty soon he's licking the blade, and the blood that he's tasting is his own. And before you know it, he bleeds out, and he's drank his blood, and he's dead, and they come along, and they have themselves a nice wolf pelt. Now, anger is just like that, right? In our thirst for blood, we are the ones who suffer. It's been said that holding on to anger and bitterness is like drinking poison to get back at the one who hurt you. Ben Franklin said, whatever is begun in anger ends in shame. Paul said this to the Romans, don't you realize that whatever you choose to obey becomes your master, and you can choose sin, which leads to death, or you can choose to obey God and receive his approval. And so some of us need to answer the question today, have I been choosing to obey my anger? Now, Jesus said something interesting in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said this, Matthew chapter 5, beginning of verse 21, you have heard it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, raka, literally that means empty-headed, right? The idea here is you take offense. You're like, what were you thinking, right? Whoever says to his brother, raka, Jesus said, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, and the idea here is that now it's not just what were you thinking, now you've passed judgment on. I'll tell you what you were thinking. You did it because of that, and so you pass judgment is the idea. And Jesus said, whoever's in that place shall be in danger of hellfire. Jesus said, therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. And you might hear that and you go, oh, wait. It says, Jesus said to do that if your brother has something against you. What if it's not my issue? I'm not the one with the issue. He's the one who did it. I'm angry at him for what he did, not for what I did to him. Oh, okay. Well, Jesus covers this in Matthew 18. In Matthew chapter 18, Jesus says this in verse 15, moreover, if your brother sins against you, now it's not if your brother has something against you. Jesus is saying if your brother has done something to you, if he's got something against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone, and if he hears you, you've gained your brother. And what do we often do? I don't go to my brother when he sins against me. I go to everybody else and say, you'll never believe what Pastor Tyler did to me. You'll never believe it. Right? And so we, No. Jesus says, you know what? Go to him. Just figure it out with him. right? And so often we don't do this. And then Jesus goes on to say, now if they won't hear you, if they won't respond to it, there's a process to follow here, but the whole goal is to win your brother. Well, after Jesus gives, this teaching in Matthew 18, Peter, he's like thinking, no doubt, he's thinking to himself, well, man, that's a tough pill to swallow. So Peter goes, well, hey, Jesus, how many times am I supposed to forgive? Like up to 7 times? Okay, I'm going to be, and I bet you in his mind, he's thinking, wow, that's a lot. That's really generous. I'm going to be patient with you. Okay, that's 1. Well, it's cool. All right, that's 2. And then you get to number 8 and you're like, boom, you get both barrels now, buddy. I was long suffering with you. And so this is what Peter says. Well, Jesus responds to him. And he goes into this elaborate story, and he basically tells the story of a king who had a servant. The servant owed him like more than he could pay back in a lifetime, monetarily speaking. He was in debt beyond his means. And so the king goes, hey man, I'm throwing you in prison. I'm going to sell your wife into slavery, your kids into slavery, you into slavery, and you don't get out, and y'all don't get your freedom until like you pay me back. And when the guy, oh, please, I can't pay you back. And so the king has compassion on him and he forgives him. So this is a parable that Jesus is telling. It's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And so he says that part of it, but he says that guy he forgave, he went right out, ran into a guy who owed him the equivalent of a couple days' wages, pales in comparison to the debt that he was forgiven. But he won't forgive him as much as the man begs. He's like, no, you're going. I'm selling you into debtor's prison, and I'm gonna exact a payment from you one way or the other. Well, word gets back to the king, and he is none too pleased. And the king, basically he says, I had pity on you, and so he says, should you not also have had compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you? And the master was angry. He delivered him to the torturers until he should pay all that was due to him. And so, Jesus concludes, my heavenly Father also will do to you if each of you do not from his heart. The word is cardia. They saw that as the center of your being. If you don't forgive from the center of your being. And so here's the idea. Jesus says, I've forgiven you immensely, and I expect you to be people of forgiveness. And you say, well, look, Pastor Ted, you don't know, what I've been through. You don't know what has been done to me. What I do know is that if you harbor unforgiveness in your heart, you're like that wolf licking that knife. And the one who's going to pay that penalty is you. It's toxic. And so, yeah, I get it. I acknowledge, some of you today, you have some forgiveness to do. You got some work to do, and you got to you got to make a phone call. You got to go to somebody. It might be somebody here in the church. And you might say, listen, I need to ask your forgiveness, and I need to extend forgiveness, whatever it is. And you need to make it right, whoever it is. You got to do that. And some of y'all, you go, I can't go to the person. There's situations, circumstances make it impossible for me to go to that person. Okay, you can turn that person over to the Lord. You can take your anger and your bitterness and you can say, Lord, I'm surrendering this to you and I'm choosing to forgive. Now, you may not be able to reconcile a relationship for various reasons that we don't have time to get into. But there might be, an abusive situation where you can't reconcile an ongoing relationship, but you can still choose to forgive and turn that person over to the Lord. And so if that's the case, man, you need to pray. You need to seek the Holy Spirit. He'll give you wisdom. Verse 6. So when that is Festus, Governor Festus, the new cat that's replaced Felix, when he had remained among the Jews there in Jerusalem more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. And when he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about, and they laid many serious complaints against Paul, which, and this is important, they could not prove. They couldn't prove these charges against Paul. And while Paul, answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, nor, this is Paul, quoting Paul here, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. Here again, similarities between Jesus and Paul are striking. Just as Jesus was on trial and was bounced between the Sanhedrin and Pontius Pilate and to King Herod and back to Pontius Pilate and so on. Here now Paul's on trial and he's bounced from Felix, now to Festus, soon King Agrippa. And in both cases, it's all based on false charges. By the way, biblically, we see a lot of people who were the victims of false accusations, false charges. Paul here, Jesus, Joseph, Daniel, a lot of guys that you think about. And the Bible actually says that you and me are the victims of false charges, that Satan is the accuser of the brethren. And he'll work overtime to lie to you. Sometimes we buy into that lie. We believe the lies of Satan. That's a whole nother message. But the fact of the matter is you have an accuser, just as Paul and Jesus and Joseph and Daniel all had accusers. And so Paul refutes the charges against him, but, verse 9, Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul, and he said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? And so Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews, I've done no wrong, as you very well know. The idea is, you know better, Festus. I'm not guilty of the things they're saying. And he says, verse 11, for if I'm an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, hey, I don't object to dying, but if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I'm going to appeal to Caesar. Now, as a Roman citizen, every Roman citizen had the right, if they didn't experience the adjudication that they thought that they should get, if they didn't think they'd receive a fair trial or the verdict that they wanted, they always had the right to appeal to Caesar. We in the U.S., we can appeal to the Supreme Court. This is a Roman equivalent of that. And so this is what Paul does. And this is the triggering event in the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy from Acts 23:11, where he told Paul, hey, chill, Paul. I'm going to, in my translation, hey, Paul, be cool. I'm doing something here, and you're actually going to, this is going to be the vehicle through which you get to Rome. And ultimately a fulfillment of his prophecy in Acts 1:8, when he told his disciples, you're going to be witnesses of me in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and indeed to the ends of the earth. And in fact, Rome is the beginning of the ends of the earth ministry. And there's some people, they argue and they go, you know what? Paul knew that because Jesus spoke that to him. So what he's doing here by appealing to Caesar, because what you're going to see next week is that Festus, having heard Paul speak, he's going to go, you know what? If he hadn't appealed to Caesar, I actually would have let him go. But he appeals to Caesar, so he's kind of sealed his fate. He's going to Rome. And some people are like, well, Paul knew what Jesus had said, and so this is just Paul, taking his own action to help Jesus out, right? He sees this opening to hasten his move to Rome. I disagree. I think Paul's just exercising pragmatic wisdom in this, in that, he understands that he's being unjustly accused, and it would really appear like things are going bad for him, and he's just using the courts, the court system as it's available to him. John Calvin said this. He said, God, who has appointed courts of law, also gives his people liberty to use them lawfully. right? And rightly, you might be thinking about, 1 Corinthians where Christians are exhorted not to sue one another. This isn't that case. This isn't a Christian suing another Christian. This is a Christian using the legal justice system to get vindication. And that's totally appropriate. I like what David Guzik said. He said, rightly and wisely, Paul wanted to avoid martyrdom if he could. Because he knows, man, if you send me to Jerusalem, they're going to kill me, right? He wasn't afraid to face the lions, but he didn't want to put his head in a lion's mouth if he could avoid it, right? It's reasonable. So Festus agrees to the appeal, but he needs some wisdom at this point. He needs wisdom to figure out, well, what am I going to say to Caesar when I send him there? Like, I think he's innocent, and in fact, I don't really understand the Jews' trip here. So I need some help with this. This is where he's at. And so verse 13, after some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. Now we're going to see that he's going to consult King Agrippa to, hey, help me figure this out. But let me introduce you to Agrippa and Bernice. And I guess the first thing you need to understand is that this is a full-on Jerry Springer couple, these two. I mean, these two are a trip. Let me start with Agrippa. This is Agrippa II. And he is the great-grandson of Herod the Great. So his great-grandfather was the guy who tried to kill Jesus and who started that plan off by saying, I'm going to kill the firstborn male child, all the kids that are 2 years of age and younger all throughout Bethlehem. I'm going to kill them. That's his great-grandfather, right? And that's also the same guy who killed most of his sons and many of his wives because he was so paranoid. There was a saying about him that it's better to be Herod's pig than his son. This is how well he was. So his great-grandfather was a piece of work. His great-uncle was also a piece of work. That was the guy who beheaded John the Baptist. And Herod II's father was the guy who ultimately would kill the Apostle James and imprison the Apostle Peter, and the Apostle Peter would later be killed because of him, right? And so this King Agrippa comes from a pretty shady family, to put it in the most positive way, right? And what's going on with this guy right now is power is starting to slip from his fingers. He used to have a lot more power, and it's been steadily diminishing. And so now the ruling area that he watches over, that he's been assigned to rule over, has been diminished to northern Israel in the region of the Sea of Galilee. So basically, he needs all the political friends he can get. This is why he comes down to greet the new governor Festus. He's trying to get in good with this guy. So that's Agrippa. Agrippa's wife, Bernice, she's an even bigger piece of work. This gal she was the sister of Drusilla, and if you remember back to last week, Felix, the governor who was before Festus, his wife was Drusilla. So Bernice, Agrippa's wife, was Drusilla's sister. Do you know who else's sister she was? Agrippa. She married her brother. Agrippa was her brother, right? Now here's how they hooked up. You got sister and brother, family trees going straight up and down now. And before she was married to her brother Agrippa, she was the mistress of Emperor Vespasian. And then she left Vespasian to shack up with his son Titus. And she and Titus later returned together to Rome. And she was so bad that even the Romans rejected her because of her immorality. Now that's saying something, right? You've heard the saying, when in Rome. Yeah, even the Romans said, no, that's nasty. We're not going to do that, right? And so ultimately, Bernice left Titus, and that's when she thought it would be a good idea to shack up with her brother Agrippa. And so they are the ultimate poster children for inclusion and tolerance, these two. And as unlikely as it sounds, Agrippa was also known as an expert in Jewish customs and religious matters, right? Now that's ironic. And so when they, Agrippa and Bernice, verse 14, had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before Agrippa. Why? Because he's an expert in Jewish matters, right? And he says, hey, there's a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking for a judgment against him. And to them I answered, it is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accusers to face to face and has the opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him. Therefore, when they had come together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and I commanded the man to be brought in. And when the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed. But had some questions against him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Yes and amen. Verse 20. And because I was uncertain of such questions, translations, I didn't have a clue what they were talking about, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus Caesar, I commanded him to be kept till I could send him to Caesar. And then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. And so this is another fulfillment of Jesus's prophecy, right? Of a different prophecy that Jesus gave. If you remember back in Acts chapter 9, right after Paul got saved on the Damascus road, and God appeared to Ananias, and he's like, hey, I want to tell you about this guy, Paul. I want you to go to him. And Ananias is like, oh, wait a minute. You know about this guy? Because this Paul guy's killing Christians, and you think that's such a good idea? Here's the prophecy that the Lord responded to Ananias with. He said, go, Acts 9:15, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before, here it is, before Gentiles. He's done that. And now, before kings, King Agrippa, the fulfillment of that, and before the children of Israel. And Paul has been doing that and will do it again. And so this is fulfillment of prophecy. Verse 23. And so the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp and had entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of Israel, at Festus's command, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa and all the men who are here present with us, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him. I have nothing certain to write to my Lord, meaning to Augustus Caesar, concerning him. Therefore, I have brought him out before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, since you're an expert in religious law or Jewish law, blah, 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 so that after the examination has taken place, I might have something to write. For it seems to be unreasonable to send a prisoner and not to specify the charges against him. And so again, the idea here is, I don't know what to write about this guy. I don't really understand it. Hoping you do. And when I send him to Caesar, I want to write something down about why I'm sending him so I don't sound like a fool to Caesar for sending him. Like, hey, I don't know what the deal is with this guy, but I can't figure it out. Maybe you can. That's not the best look. So he wants to be able to give him some sort of an informed referral according to Roman law. So Festus states his intentions here. It's very clear, right? Need your help. Help me figure out what to write so I can send him. Next week, we're going to hear Paul's defense, and we're going to see how he has the opportunity to preach the gospel. But as we close, let's bring this home and bring in some application here for us. The overarching theme here in Acts 25 is really trials and how Paul was faithful in the midst of them, right? And we're going to see that these trials, they're just starting. Like he's in chains and bondage, but what comes ahead is shipwreck, more imprisonment. Ultimately, Paul's going to be killed for his faith. But God's going to use these trials in an amazing way that could never have occurred to Paul. And they're going to open up opportunities that they already are. He's been witnessing, no doubt, to the Roman guards, to the commanders, to the governors, now before a king. But there's more ahead. He's going to witness to Caesar himself, more Roman guards, and so on. He's going to write some incredible prison epistles while he's imprisoned in Rome. And, if you were with us last week on Wednesday, at First Wednesday, Dane taught on Hebrews chapter 12. And part of his teaching focused on the race that God has marked out for each one of us. And the point that Dane made, which is absolutely biblical, is that there is a very specific race that is marked out for every single one of us. And the Bible makes it clear that race involves trials. Why? Why does our race involve trials? Two main reasons. One, because Satan opposes the work of God. And so you're going to experience demonic attack. It's been said if you haven't had a head-on collision with Satan, you might want to check and make sure you're not going in the same direction, right? So there is going to be that part of your testimony. But also part of the reason for trials in our calling, in our race, is that it's a divine appointment. That God is doing a forming work. See, God not only has a plan to work through you, which he does, but he also has a plan to work in you. And often the vehicle through which he works is trials. Let me give you an example. In your marriage, God wants to do a work through you to bless your children, to bless your family, to bless your community, to bless your world, right? But within your marriage, God also has a plan to work in you. When I counsel couples, biblical discipleship here, I don't do as much of that anymore. Our staff pastors are doing most of that. But when I have a couple who come in and, they'll be at each other's throats, and I want them to see, look, you're making your spouse the enemy, and the real enemy is Satan. And yeah, you might be able to say, well, Satan, they're working, through whatever, their disobedience or whatever it is, like they're the ones that did this, that has offended me, or that, that has wronged me, or whatever. And yes, that's true. And there is the taking of responsibility and the repentance and the confession of sin and all of that needs to take place on the physical side. But on the spiritual side, there's an enemy that is at work, that is causing conflict, that is bringing temptation, that is doing these things. There's a physical realm problem and there's a spiritual realm problem. And over all of that is God, who promises to work in both of these instances, to use these for our good. And we need to be seeking, God, how are you using this to complete me? How are you using this to grow me? In fact, it's been said that nearly every quality of character that we most admire can only be developed through trials and adversity. Think about this. How many of you remember the biosphere? Do you? Yeah, nobody. Okay. So the biosphere was this test that scientists were doing. They had created this domed-in environment where they're trying to replicate an environment that is free from outside influences, pesticides, pollution, all of that stuff. And they want to see, and ultimately they're thinking, can we create this kind of environment that we can replicate on another planet? where we can, have oxygen and nitrogen and all the stuff that we need and so on. So they did that, and, everything was growing and flourishing and doing great. But then these trees that were growing within this bubbled space randomly started breaking and falling and having, branches just too much to support their weight. And they're like, wait a minute, this doesn't happen outside the biosphere. Why are these tree branches breaking inside the biosphere? Well, what they discovered was that what they lacked in the biosphere was the buffeting winds that happen in nature, where the tree is buffeted and rocked and moved. And they say this is a trial, this is a hardship, a stress that is placed on the tree. But what the stress does is it causes the fibers within the tree's bark and skin and all, and its very makeup to become stronger. As they're stretched, then they as they're healing. It's a process called catabolism and anabolism. Catabolism is you break it down. Anabolism is you build it back up. As it builds back up, it gets stronger. Right? It's also what happens in gyms when you work out. I don't know. I'm told. And so the thing is that you take that into life. God uses the stresses, the trials, and the issues that we've got to make you stronger. And I've got verses to back it up. James says this: "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." We're going to stop right here and we're going to pray. But some of you today, I know, are dealing with some trials. And I think God has had a word for you about those. And that how we have to give those over to the Lord, and we have to trust the Lord. And we have to understand that God is using those trials. He's using those trials to perfect us. He's using those trials to mold us and shape us. And yes, for some of you, the issue is anger and unrepentance or unforgiveness. And that's a trial God would like to use, not to make you bitter, but to make you better.